The emergency room doctor's pen stopped mid-signature, his eyes widening as he lifted Margaret Rose Patterson's hospital gown to examine her neck. The clipboard clattered to the sterile floor. What he saw wasn't a simple gardening rash. It was something far more sinister that had been devouring her flesh for months. Nurse Jenkins gasped audibly, stepping backward until she hit the medicine cart with a metallic crash. The antiseptic smell suddenly felt suffocating as other staff members turned to stare through the glass partition. Margaret's son David stood frozen in the doorway, his phone still pressed to his ear from the frantic call that brought him racing from Sacramento. His mother's wedding ring, now 3 sizes too large, spun loosely on her trembling finger, a cruel reminder of how much weight she'd lost while hiding her condition. "Get oncology down here now," the doctor commanded, his voice betraying none of the calm professionalism he'd maintained for 20 years. How long had those innocent-looking bumps been silently stealing her life? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 6 months earlier, spring had arrived in Portland's Laurelhurst neighborhood with the gentle persistence that Margaret Rose Patterson had come to expect from her 42 years in the same modest ranch home. At 74, she maintained the rhythm of widowhood with the same discipline that had carried her through 35 years of teaching third graders. Coffee at 6 sharp, garden by 7, and wheel of fortune at 7:30. A routine that kept the loneliness at bay and honored Robert's memory. The backyard garden sprawled across a 1/4 acre of carefully tended earth. Every rose bush and perennial bed a testament to the partnership she'd shared with her late husband. Robert had designed the layout on graph paper during his final months, sketching pathways between the flower beds with the precision of an engineer in the heart of a romantic. "These roses will outlive us both, Maggie," he'd whispered during one of their last conversations, his weathered hand pointing toward the space where prize-winning blooms now reached toward the morning sun. Margaret's financial reality was as carefully managed as her garden. Social Security provided $1,247 each month, stretched across an $890 mortgage payment, groceries, utilities, and the $200 Medicare supplement premium that promised coverage she was beginning to doubt. Depression-era instincts guided every purchase: generic coffee over name brands, mending clothes instead of replacing them, and rationing the expensive plant fertilizer that kept Robert's dream alive. From her kitchen window next door, Ethel Mae Johnson observed Margaret's morning ritual with the trained eye of a retired Kaiser Permanente nurse. At 68, Ethel understood the peculiar loneliness of widowhood and the fierce independence that kept elderly women from asking for help. She'd lost her own husband 3 years prior and recognized the signs of someone determined to prove they could manage alone. The unspoken neighborhood etiquette meant both women tended their adjacent gardens in careful privacy, never acknowledging their mutual solitude despite sharing the same sunrise schedule. Portland's reputation as a caring community felt more like mythology than reality on quiet residential streets where people smiled politely and minded their own business. Margaret's phone rarely rang except for David's dutiful Sunday calls from Sacramento, where her software engineer son balanced his own family's demands with increasingly perfunctory check-ins on his mother's well-being. The house held 42 years of memories in every corner. Robert's reading chair still positioned beside the window, his coffee mug unwashed in the sink on particularly difficult mornings. Margaret spoke to his photograph each evening, sharing the day's small victories and defeats with the man who'd promised to love her through better or worse. The garden had become her cathedral, the place where Robert's presence felt strongest and where she could maintain the illusion that she wasn't facing old age entirely alone. This carefully constructed world of routine and independence would soon be tested by 3 small red bumps that would change everything Margaret thought she knew about survival, community, and the hidden kindness of strangers. March 15th arrived with the kind of crisp Portland morning that made Margaret's arthritic fingers ache as she wrapped them around her coffee mug. The daffodils had pushed through the last patches of winter snow, and Robert's prize roses demanded their annual pruning. She pulled on her worn gardening gloves and stepped into the backyard sanctuary that had sustained her through 5 years of widowhood. The deadheading went smoothly until she reached the climbing rose beside the back fence, Robert's favorite, a deep crimson variety he'd named Margaret's Blush during their courtship 50 years ago. As she stretched to reach a spent bloom, the thorns caught her neck just above the collar line. She cursed softly, something Robert would have gently scolded her for, and continued working until the sun climbed high enough to make her squint. It wasn't until her evening shower that Margaret noticed the 3 small red bumps clustered near her collarbone. In the bathroom mirror, they looked angry and raised, roughly the size of pencil erasers. "Probably that new fertilizer," she muttered to Robert's photograph on the dresser. David had recommended an organic blend during their last phone call, expensive stuff that promised miraculous results. At $12.99, the bag had represented nearly a week's worth of coffee, but Margaret had splurged, hoping to make Robert's roses spectacular this season. From her kitchen window, Ethel Johnson had watched Margaret's morning routine with the practiced observation of a woman who'd spent 40 years assessing patients' conditions at a glance. Something about Margaret's posture seemed different, more cautious, with frequent touches to her neck. Ethel made a mental note while preparing her own breakfast, filing the observation alongside dozens of others she'd collected about her stubborn neighbor. Margaret's first instinct was research, a habit ingrained from decades of lesson planning and managing classroom emergencies. Her ancient laptop wheezed to life as she typed, "Red bumps neck gardening allergy," into Google. The search results offered a catalog of possibilities: contact dermatitis from plant allergens, insect bites, or simple irritation from thorns. The images looked reassuringly similar to what she'd discovered on her own skin. The pharmacy visit felt like surrender. Margaret calculated the cost of cortisone cream against her weekly grocery budget. $12.99 would mean generic pasta instead of the good brand, tap water instead of bottled. She stood in the skincare aisle for 10 minutes, reading labels and comparing prices, before selecting the cheapest option available. The teenage cashier barely glanced at her purchase, but Margaret felt as though everyone in the store could see her desperation. Sunday's phone call with David followed their established script. Margaret settled into Robert's chair with her coffee, listening to her son describe his daughter's soccer tournament and his latest work project. When he asked about her week, she mentioned the little rash casually, the way she might discuss a minor headache or a stubborn dandelion in the lawn. "You know me, honey," she said, forcing lightness into her voice. "Tough as nails. Probably nothing a little cream won't fix." David's response carried the distracted quality she'd learned to expect. "That's my mom. You've survived worse than a gardening rash." In the background, she could hear her granddaughter calling for help with homework, and the conversation shifted to safer topics: weather, local news, memories of Robert that felt increasingly distant with each passing year. The first week brought subtle changes that Margaret documented with growing concern. The bumps spread outward in an irregular pattern, developing a rough texture that caught on her clothing. She began wearing higher necklines, then lightweight scarves despite the warming weather. The oatmeal paste recipe from her grandmother's handwritten cookbook provided temporary relief, but the inflammation returned each morning with renewed intensity. Margaret threw away the expensive fertilizer with the kind of dramatic gesture that would have made Robert laugh. $30 worth of organic promises landed in the garbage bin alongside her hopes for spectacular roses. She spent hours researching alternatives online, convincing herself that removing the source would solve the problem. The bumps would fade, her neck would heal, and she could return to the simple pleasure of tending Robert's dream garden without fear or embarrassment. By the third week, the scarf had become permanent. Margaret practiced explanations in the bathroom mirror, testing casual phrases that might deflect curiosity without inviting pity. "Just a little sensitivity to the new plant food," she would say. "You know how delicate skin gets at my age." The words felt hollow even as she rehearsed them, but they served their purpose of maintaining the independence she'd fought so hard to preserve since Robert's death. The church usher's concerned inquiry came as Margaret signed the attendance book with hands that trembled slightly from the previous night's interrupted sleep. "Feeling all right today, Margaret? You look a little peaked." The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Margaret's defensive response surprised even herself. "Just a touch of dermatitis. Nothing serious." She hurried to her usual pew, pulling the scarf higher and avoiding eye contact with the neighbors who'd known her for decades. That afternoon, Margaret declined 3 invitations: lunch with the garden club, coffee with her former teaching colleague, and bridge night at the community center. Each rejection felt like cutting another thread that connected her to the world beyond her garden gate. By April 20th, the 3 small bumps had transformed into something Margaret could no longer dismiss with home remedies and wishful thinking. What began as pencil eraser-sized irritations now covered a 4-inch patch of angry, inflamed skin that wept fluid onto her pillowcases each night. The itching had evolved into a constant burning sensation that no amount of cortisone cream could soothe, and Margaret found herself losing weight from sleepless nights and diminished appetite. Standing before her bathroom mirror on a Thursday morning that felt heavy with unspoken dread, Margaret confronted the reflection she'd been avoiding for weeks. The woman staring back looked hollow-eyed and fragile, nothing like the sturdy teacher who'd managed classroom emergencies with calm efficiency, or the devoted wife who'd nursed Robert through his final illness with unwavering strength. The scarf couldn't fully hide the inflammation anymore, and angry red patches crept above the fabric line like accusatory fingers. "What would Robert think of me now?" she whispered to the mirror, her voice cracking with the weight of 5 years' worth of accumulated loneliness. For the first time since her husband's funeral, Margaret allowed herself to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that echoed off the bathroom tiles and released months of suppressed fear and isolation. From her kitchen window, Ethel Johnson had been documenting Margaret's decline with the systematic attention of a trained medical professional. The neighbor who once emerged promptly at 7 each morning now appeared sporadically, moving with the careful gait of someone in constant discomfort. Ethel noted the progressive changes: the turtlenecks in 70-degree weather, the canceled garden club meetings, the grocery deliveries that suggested Margaret had stopped venturing out for routine errands. The fence-line conversation came naturally, disguised as coincidental garden maintenance while both women tended their adjoining flower beds. Ethel had rehearsed her approach, knowing that direct confrontation would trigger Margaret's defensive instincts and potentially end their fragile neighborly connection. "Margaret, honey, how's that rash treating you?" Ethel asked with studied casualness, her experienced eye noting the way Margaret instinctively touched her neck before catching herself. "It's healing fine, thank you," Margaret replied with the brittle brightness she'd perfected for deflecting unwanted attention. "Just takes time, you know. These things always look worse than they are." But Ethel's nursing instincts recognized the telltale signs of something serious: the weight loss, the fatigue evident in Margaret's posture, and most concerning, the slight confusion that seemed to cloud her neighbor's usually sharp responses. Every professional instinct screamed intervention, but decades of patient care had taught her the delicate balance between offering help and respecting autonomy. Meanwhile, Margaret had begun her own investigation into Medicare coverage, a labyrinthine process that left her feeling more helpless than empowered. The customer service hotline kept her on hold for 47 minutes, listening to cheerful music that mocked her growing anxiety about medical costs. When she finally reached a human voice, the representative explained that dermatology visits required referrals from primary care physicians, followed by specialist co-payments that could reach $200 per appointment. Margaret performed the brutal mathematics of fixed income survival, specialist visits versus grocery money, potential treatments versus mortgage payments. The numbers didn't balance no matter how many times she reworked them on the back of utility bills. She decided to wait it out, hoping that whatever was wrong would resolve itself through sheer determination and the kind of Midwestern stubbornness that had carried her through the Depression and 2 decades of widowhood. David's Sunday phone call arrived with its usual punctuality, but Margaret's performance had become increasingly difficult to maintain. She minimized her symptoms with the skill of someone who'd spent decades protecting others from worry, describing the little thing as almost completely healed while secretly calculating how many more weeks she could sustain this deception. "That's great, Mom," David responded with the distracted enthusiasm of someone juggling multiple conversations. In the background, Margaret could hear her granddaughter's voice calling for help with soccer gear, and her son's attention divided between family obligations and filial duty. The conversation lasted 12 minutes. She'd begun timing them before David excused himself to drive to the athletic fields. After hanging up, Margaret sat in Robert's chair and confronted the truth she'd been avoiding. Even her own son didn't have time to really listen. The isolation felt complete, suffocating in its totality. The Medicare Advantage denial letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered with the casual efficiency that characterized most of her correspondence these days. The medical terminology was incomprehensible. References to experimental dermatological procedures and pre-authorization requirements that assumed familiarity with healthcare bureaucracy she'd never needed to develop. The bottom line was brutally clear. Coverage denied, appeal process available, estimated timeline for resolution 60 to 90 days. Margaret felt the betrayal like a physical blow. 50 years of payroll deductions, decades of trusting that the safety net would catch her when she needed it most, and now faceless bureaucrats were determining that her condition didn't merit immediate attention. She'd played by every rule, saved what she could, never asked for handouts or special treatment, and the system she'd supported throughout her working life was abandoning her in her moment of greatest vulnerability. That evening, Margaret stood in her garden among Robert's roses and felt the weight of true helplessness for the first time in her adult life. The inflammation had begun affecting her sleep so severely that she sometimes found herself disoriented during daylight hours, unsure whether she'd taken her medications or locked the front door. The burning sensation had intensified beyond the reach of over-the-counter remedies, and she could no longer ignore the possibility that something was seriously wrong. "I think I'm in trouble, honey," she whispered to Robert's memory, her voice carrying across the garden where their shared dreams had taken root and flourished. The roses nodded in the evening breeze, offering no answers but bearing witness to a woman's slow surrender to circumstances beyond her control. By the first week of May, Margaret's world had contracted to the dimensions of her modest ranch home, the walls closing in with each passing day as her condition deteriorated beyond her ability to manage alone. The inflammation had spread across her neck and shoulder, creating a landscape of angry lesions that wept constantly and resisted every home remedy she desperately applied. Sleep had become a luxury she could rarely afford, interrupted by burning pain that no position could alleviate and itching so intense it left her fingernails bloody from unconscious scratching. The mirror had become her enemy, reflecting a stranger with hollow cheeks and frightened eyes that belonged to someone she didn't recognize. Margaret had lost 22 pounds, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that seemed to shrink daily. The wedding ring Robert had placed on her finger 51 years ago now spun freely, requiring tape to keep it in place, a cruel reminder of how much of herself had simply disappeared while she'd been fighting this losing battle in isolation. Church attendance ended without announcement or explanation, Margaret's pew remaining empty while longtime friends made polite inquiries that went unanswered. The garden club meetings she'd faithfully attended for 2 decades became impossible to imagine. The thought of exposing her condition to curious eyes and well-meaning questions filling her with panic. Even grocery shopping, once a weekly adventure that connected her to community life, had been surrendered to online delivery services that allowed her to avoid human contact entirely. The grocery delivery arrangement with Safeway felt like the final admission of defeat, each transaction a reminder of how thoroughly her independence had been compromised. Margaret found herself scheduling deliveries for times when Ethel was least likely to be watching from her kitchen window, hoping to avoid the concerned glances that had become increasingly frequent. The delivery drivers were kind but professional, unloading bags onto her front porch with cheerful efficiency that highlighted her isolation rather than alleviating it. From her strategic observation post, Ethel Johnson documented Margaret's decline with growing alarm and professional frustration. 40 years of nursing had taught her to recognize the signs of serious illness, and every instinct screamed that her neighbor was facing something far more dangerous than a gardening rash. The lack of morning garden visits, the drawn curtains that remained closed throughout sunny afternoons, and most troubling, the 3-week absence from any outdoor activity suggested either severe depression or physical incapacitation. Ethel's own experience with widowhood had taught her the delicate balance between respecting privacy and recognizing genuine need. She began keeping an informal log of Margaret's visible activities, or lack thereof, noting the days when no lights appeared in the windows, when mail accumulated uncollected, when the sprinkler system ran but no human presence emerged to tend the beloved roses. Her nursing instincts battled against neighborhood etiquette, creating an internal conflict that kept her awake at night. By the 6th week, several of Margaret's lesions had developed secondary bacterial infections, turning simple inflammation into something that required immediate medical attention. Without access to proper wound care or antiseptic supplies, she'd been treating the infected areas with hydrogen peroxide and expired antibiotics left over from a 2019 dental procedure. The fever that developed seemed manageable at first, just low-grade warmth that she attributed to Oregon's unusually humid spring weather. Margaret's conversations with Robert's photograph had evolved from daily comfort rituals into desperate consultations with the only person who'd ever truly understood her stubborn independence. "I don't know what to do anymore, honey," she whispered during particularly difficult nights when the pain made sleep impossible. "I think I might have gotten myself into something I can't handle alone." The admission felt like betrayal of everything she'd worked to maintain since his death. David's Sunday calls had become exercises in elaborate deception, Margaret summoning energy she didn't possess to maintain the fiction that everything was fine. By week 8, even this performance had become difficult to sustain. Her voice, weakened by poor nutrition and disrupted sleep, carried tremors she couldn't disguise, and her responses to his routine questions sometimes came several seconds late as she struggled to focus through fever-induced confusion. "Mom, you don't sound right," David said during their 9th-week conversation, genuine concern breaking through his usual distraction. "Are you feeling okay? You sound kind of foggy." Margaret's defensive response came automatically, honed by weeks of practice. "I haven't been sleeping well, that's all. You know how it is at my age. Everything takes longer to heal." But privately, she acknowledged that her son had detected something she could no longer completely hide. The conversation lasted 18 minutes, David's longest attention span in months, and ended with an unusual promise to call again midweek. The grocery delivery incident occurred on a Thursday afternoon when Margaret's fever had spiked to levels that left her disoriented and unsteady. She'd forgotten about the scheduled delivery until the doorbell's insistent ringing pulled her from confused sleep on the living room sofa. Opening the door required tremendous effort, and she knew immediately from the delivery driver's shocked expression that her appearance had crossed some invisible line from concerning to alarming. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The young man's voice carried genuine worry as he took in Margaret's pale complexion, the visible inflammation creeping above her hastily arranged scarf, and the way she gripped the doorframe for support. "Should I call someone for you? Do you need medical help?" Margaret's humiliation was complete. A stranger, a boy young enough to be her grandson, was seeing her at her most vulnerable, offering help she desperately needed but couldn't accept without destroying the last vestiges of her dignity. "Please don't tell anyone," she pleaded, hating the weakness in her voice. "I'm fine, really. Just having a difficult day." But the driver's concern followed her long after he'd departed, his offer of assistance echoing in her mind during the long hours when fever and pain created a surreal landscape where reality and nightmare blended seamlessly. Margaret began to understand that her situation had moved beyond stubborn self-reliance into genuine danger. Though admitting this truth required courage, she wasn't certain she still possessed. The financial calculations that had once seemed manageable now appeared insurmountable. Medical bills from a single urgent care visit had reached $847, forcing her to choose between paying utilities and maintaining her mortgage. The Medicare Advantage plan's denial letters had multiplied, each one containing increasingly complex language about coverage limitations and appeal procedures that seemed designed to discourage rather than inform. Margaret's kitchen table had become a battlefield of unpaid bills, insurance forms, and hastily scribbled calculations that never balanced in her favor. Sleep deprivation had begun affecting her cognitive function in ways that frightened her more than the physical symptoms. Simple tasks like remembering whether she'd locked the front door or taken her blood pressure medication required tremendous concentration. Sometimes she found herself standing in rooms with no memory of why she'd come there, or discovering that hours had passed while she sat motionless in Robert's chair, lost in confusion that felt like drowning. Ethel's documentation had evolved from concerned observation to active preparation for intervention. Her nursing background had taught her to recognize the signs of elder self-neglect, and Margaret's situation exhibited every warning indicator she'd been trained to identify. The absence of visitors, the declined invitations to social activities, and most critically, the obvious physical deterioration visible even from a distance suggested someone who'd moved beyond the ability to care for herself safely. The moral weight of maintaining professional boundaries while watching a neighbor suffer in isolation created sleepless nights for Ethel as well. Her own experience with Medicare bureaucracy and elder care systems had shown her how easily people could fall through cracks in the healthcare safety net, particularly proud individuals who'd spent lifetimes believing that self-reliance was sufficient protection against life's cruelest challenges. Margaret's Sunday night ritual of speaking to Robert's photograph had become increasingly desperate, her conversations shifting from comfortable companionship to urgent pleas for guidance she could no longer find within herself. "I don't know how much longer I can do this alone," she admitted to his familiar smile, the words carrying weight that terrified her even as she spoke them aloud. The garden visible through the bedroom window showed signs of neglect that would have horrified both of them just months earlier, Robert's prize roses dropping petals that no one remained strong enough to collect. June 16th began with the kind of oppressive Portland heat that made Margaret's inflamed skin feel like it was burning from within. She'd managed perhaps 2 hours of broken sleep, awakening repeatedly to find her pillowcase soaked with fluid from the weeping lesions that had consumed nearly her entire neck and shoulder area. The fever that had been her constant companion for 3 weeks spiked during the early morning hours, bringing with it a disorientation that made simple tasks feel monumentally complex. Margaret attempted her usual morning routine, coffee first, then assessment of the garden's needs, but standing at the kitchen counter required gripping the edges for support. Her hands trembled as she spooned instant coffee into a mug, the generic brand she'd switched to when grocery money became impossibly tight. Through the window, Robert's roses drooped in the heat, their petals scattered across unmown grass that had grown wild during her weeks of incapacity. The bathroom trip that changed everything began innocently enough. Margaret had been managing her deteriorating condition through careful movements and strategic rest periods, treating her own body like a fragile piece of equipment that required delicate handling. But the fever had intensified overnight, bringing with it a dizzying weakness that made even familiar tasks treacherous. She never remembered falling. One moment she was reaching for the towel rack, the next she was lying on cold tile with warm blood trickling from where her head had struck the porcelain sink. The impact left her stunned and confused, pain radiating through her skull, while the infected lesions on her neck burned with renewed intensity from the jarring contact with the floor. For 2 hours, Margaret lay on her bathroom floor, too weak and disoriented to call for help. The cordless phone in the bedroom might as well have been on Mars. The distance seemed impossible to traverse on hands and knees. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally aware of dust motes dancing in sunbeams that shifted across the tiles, marking time she couldn't afford to lose. When clarity finally returned enough for purposeful action, Margaret's first instinct was to call David rather than emergency services. Pride still governed her decisions, even as her body betrayed every attempt at independence. Using the bathroom counter for support, she pulled herself upright and made the agonizing journey to the bedroom phone, each step requiring tremendous willpower and careful planning. David answered on the second ring, his familiar voice carrying the casual warmth of someone expecting a routine conversation. "Hi, Mom. You're calling early today. Everything okay?" Margaret's voice came out as a whisper, barely audible and thick with confusion. "David, honey, I think I need help. I fell in the bathroom, and I don't think I can manage this anymore." The silence that followed lasted only seconds, but Margaret could hear her son's world shifting through the phone line. When David spoke again, his voice carried the sharp focus of crisis recognition. "Mom, I'm calling 911 right now. Don't hang up the phone. Stay on the line with me." "No, please," Margaret pleaded, her lifetime of self-reliance making one final desperate stand. "I don't want strangers seeing me like this. I just need to rest. Maybe call Dr. Peterson tomorrow." But David's tone had transformed from casual concern to parental authority, a role reversal that struck both of them with its finality. "Mom, you're going to the hospital now. I'm not negotiating this. You should have called me weeks ago." The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, though Margaret experienced time as a fluid thing that moved in waves of awareness and confusion. She heard Ethel Johnson's voice in the front yard, speaking with paramedics in the professional cadence that revealed her medical background. Through her bedroom window, Margaret could see her neighbor had followed the emergency vehicle, still wearing her gardening apron and carrying the authority of someone accustomed to medical crises. Ethel's presence in the emergency room waiting area provided comfort Margaret hadn't expected. Her neighbor had driven her own car to OHSU, arriving before the ambulance and somehow assuming the role of advocate that Margaret desperately needed but had been too proud to request. When admissions staff asked about next of kin and emergency contacts, Ethel provided information with the efficiency of someone who'd anticipated this moment for weeks. The triage nurse's reaction to Margaret's condition provided the first objective confirmation of how serious her situation had become. Professional composure cracked slightly as experienced hands examined the infected lesions that had transformed Margaret's neck and shoulder into something resembling raw meat. Whispered consultations between medical staff suggested urgency that Margaret's own assessment had failed to recognize. "Mrs. Patterson, how long has this been going on?" Dr. Sarah Chen asked, with the kind of controlled calm that indicated serious concern. The emergency room physician had seen thousands of cases during her 15-year career, but Margaret's presentation suggested months of neglect that bordered on life-threatening. Margaret's confused timeline revealed the depth of her denial and isolation. "Just a few weeks," she insisted, though her medical records would later show a 3-month progression that had been meticulously documented through missed appointments, declined referrals, and insurance complications that had created deadly delays. The $47,000 treatment estimate arrived with bureaucratic efficiency that felt deliberately cruel. Hospital billing representatives explained costs with apologetic professionalism, while Margaret struggled to comprehend numbers that exceeded her annual income by multiples she couldn't calculate. The Medicare gap that had seemed manageable in theory became a chasm that threatened to swallow her remaining savings and leave her financially destroyed even if treatment succeeded. "I can't afford to live," Margaret whispered to Ethel, the words carrying despair that decades of Depression-era resilience couldn't overcome. The social worker called to discuss financial assistance options spoke in acronyms and program names that required translation, each potential source of help buried beneath layers of paperwork and qualification requirements that seemed designed to discourage rather than assist. David's emergency flight from Sacramento cost $680 on a credit card that was already approaching its limit, the expense representing another sacrifice in a crisis that was consuming his family's resources as thoroughly as it had devastated his mother's. During the 3-hour flight, he replayed every Sunday phone call, searching for warning signs he'd missed while managing his own life's demands. The guilt felt crushing. How had he failed to recognize that his mother was dying alone just 800 miles away? Airport anxiety transformed routine delays into agonizing obstacles. David found himself bargaining with a universe that had already extracted too high a price from his family, promising better attention, more frequent visits, anything that might undo months of neglect that couldn't be reversed. The rental car GPS guided him through Portland traffic that seemed deliberately designed to test his patience, while his mother fought for her life in a hospital room he'd never seen. Ethel's confession in the hospital corridor provided context that David desperately needed but wasn't prepared to handle. For 6 weeks, his mother's neighbor had been documenting Margaret's decline through photographs taken surreptitiously from her kitchen window, creating a visual timeline that revealed the true scope of medical neglect that had occurred under everyone's noses. "She was hiding it from you, honey," Ethel explained with the gentle directness of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news to families in crisis. "But I could see her getting sicker every day. I should have intervened sooner, but she's so proud and I didn't want to overstep boundaries." The photographs Ethel shared told a story David couldn't have imagined from his weekly phone calls. Images of his mother moving through her garden with increasing difficulty, visible weight loss that became dramatic over weeks, and most shocking, the progression of visible lesions that had been carefully hidden during their video conversations through strategic clothing and camera angles. David's breakdown in the hospital hallway felt inevitable. The accumulated pressure of realization, guilt, and fear finally overwhelming his ability to maintain composure. His mother, the woman who'd raised him to believe that problems had solutions if you worked hard enough, was dying from a treatable condition because the healthcare system had failed her as completely as he had. The biopsy results arrived on June 18th, with the clinical efficiency that characterized most of Margaret's medical experience, typed on letterhead that transformed her worst fears into undeniable medical fact. Dr. Chen delivered the diagnosis in her office, a sterile space decorated with certificates and awards that seemed to mock the gravity of the conversation taking place beneath them. Mrs. Patterson, the pathology report confirms aggressive basal cell carcinoma, Dr. Chen said, her voice carrying the practiced gentleness of someone who'd delivered countless devastating diagnoses. The tumor has been growing for considerably longer than the 3 months you initially reported. Based on the size and depth of invasion, we're looking at a timeline closer to 8 to 10 months of development. Margaret felt the words wash over her like cold water, each syllable carrying implications she wasn't prepared to comprehend. Cancer. The disease that had claimed her sister 15 years earlier, that had taken Robert's brother, that represented everything she'd feared but never expected to face alone. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent months blaming Robert's roses for a condition that had been silently consuming her flesh while she tended his memorial garden. "If we caught this 3 months ago," Dr. Chen continued with professional honesty that felt brutal, "the treatment options would have been significantly simpler and the prognosis much more favorable. At this stage, we're looking at extensive surgical intervention followed by aggressive follow-up care." Ethel Johnson sat beside Margaret's hospital bed, her retired nurse's training allowing her to process medical information with clarity that Margaret couldn't muster. She held Margaret's hand while Dr. Chen explained treatment protocols, insurance complications, and recovery timelines that stretched into months of uncertainty. The gesture felt more intimate than any physical contact Margaret had experienced since Robert's death. "So it's cancer," Margaret whispered, the word carrying weight that seemed to crush whatever remained of her carefully maintained independence. "I've been fighting cancer with oatmeal paste and wishful thinking." The treatment plan Dr. Chen outlined felt as overwhelming as the diagnosis itself. Mohs surgery would require removing tissue layer by layer until clear margins could be established, a process that might take multiple procedures and leave her with wounds requiring plastic reconstruction. The estimated cost of $15,000 for the surgical intervention didn't include the additional $22,000 needed for cosmetic repair, figures that existed in a financial universe entirely separate from Margaret's reality. Insurance battles began immediately. The Medicare Advantage plan that had denied coverage for routine dermatology visits now required to confront the consequences of their bureaucratic delays. Pre-authorization requests that could have been processed in days when Margaret first noticed symptoms now demanded emergency intervention that threatened to bankrupt both patient and provider. "The insurance company will need to approve each phase of treatment," the hospital's financial counselor explained with apologetic efficiency. "Given the advanced nature of your condition, we can probably expedite the authorization process, but you should be prepared for significant out-of-pocket expenses." Margaret's despair felt complete. The cruel mathematics of American healthcare reducing her to a collection of treatment codes and billing categories that bore no relationship to her humanity or her decades of responsible citizenship. "Maybe it's my time," she said to Ethel with the exhausted acceptance of someone who'd run out of fight. "I can't afford to live through this, and I can't afford to die from it either." David's arrival at OHSU came with the frantic energy of someone trying to compensate for months of insufficient attention through concentrated effort. The son who'd last seen his mother at Christmas, healthy, independent, managing her widowhood with characteristic determination, now confronted a stranger whose physical deterioration shocked him into silence. The woman in the hospital bed bore little resemblance to the sturdy teacher who'd raised him, or the devoted wife who'd cared for his father through his final illness. "Mom, why didn't you tell me how bad this was?" David asked, through tears that carried guilt, love, and terror in equal measure. "I could have helped." "I should have been here." Margaret's response revealed the complex emotional mathematics that had governed her decision-making throughout the crisis. "You have your own family to worry about, honey. I didn't want to be a burden. I thought I could handle it like I've handled everything else since your father died." The hospital hallway breakdown that followed felt inevitable, David's composure finally overwhelmed by the accumulated weight of realization and regret. His mother, the woman who'd taught him that problems had solutions if you approached them with determination and common sense, was dying from a treatable condition because everyone who should have protected her had failed in different but equally devastating ways. "I failed your father's memory," David sobbed to Ethel Johnson, the neighbor who'd shown more consistent concern for Margaret than her own son had managed. "I promised him I'd take care of her, and I let her suffer alone for months while I was too busy to pay attention." Margaret's response, delivered from the hospital bed where monitors tracked vital signs that had been compromised by months of neglect, carried the forgiveness that had always characterized her approach to family relationships. "You're here now. That's what matters. We'll figure this out together." The Medicare maze that unfolded over the following days revealed the true scope of healthcare inequality that trapped elderly Americans between medical necessity and financial impossibility. Social workers explained coverage gaps with professional sympathy, while hospital administrators calculated treatment costs that bore no relationship to fixed incomes or lifetime savings carefully preserved through decades of responsible financial planning. Appeal processes designed to protect insurance company profits rather than patient welfare promised 60-day reviews for treatments that needed to begin within 30 days. Margaret's condition had moved beyond the luxury of bureaucratic timelines, but the healthcare system operated according to actuarial tables rather than human urgency. "We'll figure out the money later," David declared with the desperate determination of someone willing to mortgage his own family's future to save his mother's life. "Right now, we focus on getting you well." 3 generations of stubbornness collided in that hospital room. Margaret's refusal to accept help, David's guilt-driven insistence on taking control, and the institutional barriers that reduced human suffering to administrative procedures. Ethel Johnson served as mediator, her nursing background providing the practical wisdom that both family members needed, but neither could access through the fog of crisis and recrimination. The family dynamics that emerged revealed decades of well-intentioned but inadequate communication, love expressed through duty rather than genuine connection, and the dangerous assumption that independence was always preferable to interdependence, even when survival hung in the balance. The first plot twist arrived disguised as routine bureaucracy on June 21st, when Margaret's phone rang at 7:30 in the morning with news that defied everything she'd learned to expect from Medicare's labyrinthine appeals process. The voice on the other end belonged to Patricia Hernandez, a Medicare appeals officer whose professional demeanor carried an unusual note of urgency that immediately captured Margaret's attention. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm calling regarding your recent coverage denial for dermatological treatment," Patricia said, her tone suggesting news that transcended routine administrative updates. "Your case has been flagged for emergency review, and I'm pleased to inform you that full coverage has been approved retroactively, effective immediately." Margaret's confusion felt complete as she struggled to process information that contradicted months of denial letters and bureaucratic obstacles. "I don't understand." "The letter said my condition wasn't covered, that I needed pre-authorization that could take months." "Ma'am, your case triggered our Elder Advocacy Review Protocol," Patricia explained with the kind of professional satisfaction that suggested genuine pleasure in delivering good news. "When certain documentation patterns are identified by our Oversight Committee, we're authorized to expedite coverage decisions and reverse previous denials." The revelation that someone had been advocating for her behind the scenes felt surreal, challenging Margaret's fundamental understanding of her isolation during the medical crisis. For months, she'd believed herself abandoned by systems and people she'd trusted, fighting alone against bureaucratic indifference that seemed designed to exhaust rather than assist elderly patients seeking necessary care. Ethel Johnson's confession came later that morning, delivered with the matter-of-fact directness that characterized her approach to most difficult conversations. Margaret had been struggling with gratitude that felt almost too overwhelming to accept when her neighbor knocked on the hospital room door with the kind of purposeful expression that suggested important revelations. "Margaret, honey, I need to tell you something that might upset you, but I hope you'll understand why I did it," Ethel began, settling into the visitor's chair with the careful movements of someone preparing for a potentially confrontational conversation. The documentation Ethel revealed transformed Margaret's understanding of her neighbor's apparently casual concern during the months of medical decline. For 6 weeks, Ethel had been methodically photographing Margaret's deteriorating condition from her kitchen window, creating a visual timeline that demonstrated progressive neglect of a vulnerable elderly person living alone without adequate support systems. "I contacted Adult Protective Services 3 weeks ago," Ethel continued, watching Margaret's face for signs of anger or betrayal. "Not to have you removed from your home or declared incompetent, but to trigger the elder advocacy protocols that Medicare is required to follow when documentation shows systematic healthcare barriers affecting vulnerable adults." Margaret's emotional response surprised both women. Rather than the indignation Ethel had anticipated, Margaret felt a complex mixture of gratitude and embarrassment that someone had cared enough to violate social boundaries on her behalf. The photographs Ethel showed her revealed a progression of decline that Margaret herself hadn't fully recognized, visual evidence of a woman slowly disappearing while maintaining the fiction of successful independence. "You went behind my back," Margaret said softly, the words carrying wonder rather than accusation. "You were watching over me when I thought everyone had forgotten I existed." The network of retired healthcare professionals that Ethel revealed had been operating invisibly throughout Margaret's crisis represented a community resource that Portland's elderly residents rarely knew existed. Former nurses, social workers, and medical administrators maintained informal networks designed to catch vulnerable individuals who fell through official safety nets, advocating behind the scenes when bureaucratic systems failed to respond to human need. "We've all seen too many people like you suffer alone," Ethel explained, her voice carrying the weight of professional experience that spanned decades of patient advocacy. "Medicare isn't designed for people who don't know how to fight the system, and most elderly patients don't have the energy or knowledge to navigate appeals processes while they're dealing with serious medical conditions." The second major revelation came through David's investigation into his mother's insurance coverage, prompted by curiosity about the sudden reversal of Medicare's previous denials. His software engineer's systematic approach to problem-solving had led him to request detailed documentation of his mother's case, revealing a paper trail that exposed the true scope of healthcare inequality affecting elderly Americans. Margaret's dermatological condition had been developing for nearly 8 months before she'd first noticed the visible symptoms that prompted her initial self-treatment attempts. The cancer that she'd attributed to gardening exposure had actually begun during the previous summer, progressing silently while she'd been focused on maintaining Robert's memorial garden and preserving her independence following his death. "The timeline doesn't match your plant allergy theory, Mom," David explained with gentle honesty that acknowledged the complexity of medical diagnosis. "Dr. Chen says this type of cancer typically develops over months or even years before becoming visible. The roses weren't responsible. They were just coincidental timing." The irony felt crushing to Margaret, who'd spent months blaming the garden she'd shared with Robert for a condition that had been silently consuming her flesh while she'd tended his memory through careful cultivation of his favorite flowers. The guilt and self-recrimination that had characterized her approach to the medical crisis now seemed not only misplaced, but actively harmful to her recovery process. Community revelation arrived through unexpected channels as word of Margaret's situation spread through networks of concern that had existed invisibly throughout her months of isolation. Church members, garden club colleagues, and longtime neighbors emerged with stories of awareness and unsuccessful attempts to offer help that had been deflected by Margaret's determined independence. "We all knew something was wrong," admitted Helen Morrison, Margaret's former teaching colleague who visited the hospital with flowers and guilt-laden apologies. "Everyone assumed someone else was checking on you regularly. We were all waiting for someone else to take responsibility." The collective guilt that emerged revealed Portland's caring community reputation as partially mythical, dependent on assumptions about social networks that often failed vulnerable individuals who needed them most. Margaret's isolation hadn't been entirely self-imposed. It had been enabled by a community-wide diffusion of responsibility that allowed everyone to feel concerned without anyone taking action. The financial miracle that materialized seemed to contradict everything Margaret had learned about medical costs and insurance limitations. Church members organized a GoFundMe campaign that raised $23,000 within 48 hours, exceeding the target amount through donations from people Margaret barely remembered but who'd been touched by her decades of teaching or community involvement. Garden Club members established a home care rotation that promised practical support during her recovery period, while Medicare's retroactive coverage activation eliminated the crushing debt that had seemed insurmountable just days earlier. The transformation from financial catastrophe to manageable medical treatment felt too sudden to trust, challenging Margaret's fundamental assumptions about self-reliance and community support. "I thought I was forgotten," Margaret whispered to Ethel as they reviewed the documentation of community response that had mobilized around her crisis. "I thought I was facing this alone because that's what I deserved for not taking better care of myself." The revelation that her isolation had been partially self-imposed, partially community-enabled, and largely systematic rather than personal, transformed Margaret's understanding of both her crisis and her recovery. The people who'd seemed absent had been present but ineffective, caring but paralyzed by assumptions about other people's responsibilities and her own preferences for independence over interdependence. The Mohs surgery took place on July 3rd in a sterile operating suite that felt worlds away from the garden where Margaret's ordeal had begun 4 months earlier. Dr. Patricia Wong, OHSU's chief dermatologic surgeon, worked with methodical precision through 3 separate procedures, removing cancerous tissue layer by layer until clear margins finally appeared under the microscope. What had started as 3 small bumps, Margaret blamed on rose thorns, had required the removal of tissue extending nearly to her collarbone, leaving a wound that would need extensive reconstruction. Margaret awoke from anesthesia to find David holding her hand, and Ethel adjusting flowers that had arrived from people she'd forgotten had her address. The immediate relief she'd expected was tempered by the reality of her appearance. Bandages covered half her neck and shoulder, and the mirror David tried to hide revealed a woman who looked like she'd survived a battle rather than a medical procedure. "The margins were clean, Mom," David said with the kind of restrained optimism that characterized most of their conversations during her treatment. "Dr. Wong says she got everything and the reconstruction surgery went better than expected. You're going to be okay." Recovery proved more challenging than the surgery itself. Margaret's body, weakened by months of poor nutrition and disrupted sleep, struggled to heal wounds that would have been manageable for someone in better physical condition. The plastic reconstruction required 2 additional procedures, each one representing progress toward normalcy that felt achingly slow to someone accustomed to immediate results from hard work and determination. Physical therapy sessions at OHSU became Margaret's introduction to a world of elderly patients fighting their own battles against bodies that had betrayed them in various ways. The community she discovered in waiting rooms and rehabilitation centers revealed the hidden population of aging Americans navigating medical crises with courage that rarely received public recognition. Stories shared during chemotherapy treatments created bonds that transcended the isolation Margaret had experienced during her months of denial. By September, Margaret had regained most of the weight she'd lost during her crisis, though the mirror still showed a woman fundamentally changed by her experience with mortality and community dependence. The scars from her reconstruction were healing well, but they served as permanent reminders of how close she'd come to dying from treatable cancer while surrounded by people who could have helped if she'd known how to ask. David's decision to relocate to Portland represented the most dramatic family change prompted by Margaret's medical crisis. His software engineering job could be performed remotely from anywhere with reliable internet, and his daughter's upcoming high school years provided a natural transition point for family relocation. The move wasn't presented as caregiving or monitoring. Margaret's pride couldn't have tolerated such direct acknowledgement of her vulnerability, but as a lifestyle choice that happened to bring extended family closer together. Sacramento was never really home anyway, David explained as he supervised the installation of a security system that would allow him to monitor his mother's well-being without compromising her independence. Portland has better schools for Emma, and the tech scene is growing. It just makes sense for our family. Margaret understood the fiction they were maintaining for her dignity's sake, but she also recognized the genuine desire for connection that had been missing from their relationship since Robert's death. David's weekly visits weren't duty calls anymore. They'd evolved into collaborative projects that honored her expertise while ensuring her safety. Ethel Johnson's friendship had deepened into something resembling sisterhood, built on shared experiences of widowhood, medical advocacy, and the kind of mutual dependence that Margaret had spent years avoiding. Their morning garden consultations became daily rituals that provided structure and social connection without requiring formal acknowledgement of caregiving relationships. "You know, Robert would have loved seeing us work together like this," Margaret said one morning as they planned the spring bulb planting that would commemorate her first anniversary of successful cancer treatment. "He always said the best gardens were community projects." The garden itself had been transformed during Margaret's recovery into something that honored Robert's original design while accommodating her changed physical limitations and expanded social connections. Raised beds reduced the bending required for maintenance, while wider paths accommodated the wheelchair she'd needed during her immediate post-surgical period. Community involvement had evolved from the crisis response mobilization of her medical emergency into sustainable patterns of mutual support that extended beyond Margaret's individual needs. The Laurelhurst Neighborhood Care Network, established during her recovery, provided systematic wellness checks for elderly residents while respecting their autonomy and dignity. Margaret found herself serving as a founding coordinator for the network, her experience with Medicare navigation and medical advocacy making her unexpectedly valuable to other seniors facing similar challenges. Speaking at senior centers about early cancer detection and healthcare self-advocacy provided purpose that transformed her trauma into community resource. "I thought I was protecting my independence by handling everything alone," Margaret told audiences at her presentations, her scars visible above the necklines she no longer tried to hide. "What I learned is that real independence comes from building community connections that support you when life gets difficult." The Medicare expansion advocacy work that grew from Margaret's experience connected her with state legislators and healthcare policy organizations working to eliminate coverage gaps that trapped elderly Americans between medical necessity and financial impossibility. Her testimony before the Oregon State Legislature about insurance delays and bureaucratic barriers helped passage of emergency coverage provisions that would protect other vulnerable patients. Financial recovery had exceeded Margaret's most optimistic projections. The GoFundMe campaign had covered medical costs not addressed by Medicare, while the Community Support Network had eliminated many routine expenses through volunteer assistance with home maintenance, grocery shopping, and transportation to medical appointments. Her savings account, depleted during months of medical uncertainty, had been replenished through careful budgeting and the elimination of isolation-related expenses. David's family integration into Portland life had created the multi-generational household structure that had been missing since Robert's death. His daughter, Emma's frequent visits provided intergenerational connection that enriched everyone involved, while his presence offered security without compromising Margaret's autonomy. "Grandma, tell me again about how you survived cancer by talking to plants," Emma requested during one of their garden tours, her 16-year-old perspective finding inspiration in Margaret's story rather than focusing on its frightening elements. "I didn't survive because I talked to plants, sweetheart," Margaret corrected with the gentle precision that had characterized her teaching career. "I survived because I finally learned to listen when people were trying to help me, and because I stopped believing that asking for help was the same thing as giving up." The teaching garden that had emerged from Robert's memorial space served multiple community functions: environmental education for neighborhood children, therapeutic horticulture for seniors managing health challenges, and social gathering space for the informal support network that had developed around Margaret's recovery. Margaret's pride in the garden's evolution reflected her broader transformation from someone who'd viewed independence as isolation to someone who understood independence as the ability to contribute meaningfully to community well-being. The roses Robert had planted still bloomed each summer, but they were now surrounded by vegetables grown for the food bank and flowers maintained by volunteer groups that made the space accessible to people with various physical limitations. Christmas dinner at Margaret's house included David's family, Ethel and her adult children, and several neighbors who'd become close friends during her recovery period. The table that had been set for one throughout her widowhood now accommodated 8 people, representing 3 generations of chosen family. The toast that Margaret offered reflected the gratitude that had replaced the bitterness she'd carried during her months of medical crisis, to second chances and neighbors who don't give up on stubborn old women who don't know how to ask for help when they need it most. Robert's empty chair had been replaced by a small table holding a single rose from the garden and his photograph, acknowledging his continued presence in Margaret's life while making room for the community that had formed around his memory. The ritual honored both grief and gratitude, without requiring anyone to choose between them. Margaret's reflection on her transformation often returned to the morning she'd first noticed the red bumps that had seemed so insignificant compared to the garden tasks that demanded her attention. The woman who'd blamed plant allergies for life-threatening cancer had learned to distinguish between the problems she could solve alone and those that required community support. "Sometimes you have to almost lose everything to understand what really matters," Margaret wrote in her journal, a practice that had begun during her hospital stay and continued throughout her recovery. "I spent so much time protecting my independence that I almost lost my life." Real strength isn't about handling everything alone. It's about building relationships that can handle anything together. The epilogue of Margaret's story continued to unfold through daily choices that balanced self-reliance with community connection, honoring Robert's memory while embracing the future that had seemed impossible during her darkest medical moments. Her scars had faded to silver lines that caught sunlight as she worked in the garden, permanent reminders of survival, community, and the grace that had carried her through her valley of shadows into unexpected abundance. The final wisdom Margaret had gained was perhaps the most important: that gardens, like lives, flourish best when they're tended by caring hands working together toward shared hopes rather than individual fears. Margaret's story isn't just about surviving cancer, it's about discovering that the independence we've spent our lives building can become a prison when we need help most. At 74, she nearly died protecting her pride while her community waited for permission to care. How many of us have convinced ourselves that asking for help means admitting failure? Margaret learned that real strength isn't enduring suffering alone. It's building relationships strong enough to catch us when we fall. Her neighbor Ethel didn't just save her life by calling Adult Protective Services. She showed Margaret that being seen in our vulnerability is the beginning of authentic connection, not the end of our dignity. The garden that Margaret thought was killing her became the symbol of her rebirth when community hands joined hers in tending it. Medicare may have failed her initially, but human kindness never did. Margaret's roses still bloom today, tended by friends who understand that independence flourishes best in the soil of interdependence. Her scars aren't shameful reminders of weakness. They're beautiful evidence of survival, community, and second chances. Sometimes the very thing we're most afraid of losing, our self-sufficiency, is exactly what we need to surrender to find true security, purpose, and joy in our golden years. What signs of isolation have you noticed in your own life or community? How might Margaret's story change the way you think about accepting help from others? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.